From the University of California's California-China Climate Institute, this is Climate Dialogues with Jerry Brown. In Episode 2, Mary Nichols, the former chair of the California Air Resources Board and Institute Vice Chair, joins Institute Chair Jerry Brown to discuss carbon markets, low-carbon transportation, and California climate policy. Over a career spanning more than 4 decades, Mary Nichols has played a pivotal role in shaping California's environmental and climate policy, following her training as an environmental lawyer. Listen to their conversation now.
As our new vice chair, you're bringing your vast experience in the environmental regulation, environmental field, as well as being the longest serving chair of the California Air Resources Board. You served almost as long as I served. Maybe you served longer for all I know, because you served under many different governors. I think that's true. Anyway, tell me, what makes California unique in this field of environment, emission reduction, and specifically now dealing with the problems of climate change?
Well, I could quote you from a talk I once heard you give to a group of visitors from India about what makes California unique, which is that we're a big state, we're diverse, relatively speaking, we're wealthy, we're blessed with a lot of resources, including solar and wind and other kinds of resources as well. And it's a very beautiful state. And the people who live here, wherever they came from, have a tendency to very quickly adopt the view that protecting the environment is something important. And it has been a hallmark of California, even though we haven't always done it evenly or perfectly. But over the years, since I moved here, I'm not a native Californian, even though my kids are, but I came out in 1971 and the smog was pretty terrible and people were mad about it and they wanted us to do something about it. And so despite the fact that we were doing sometimes things that were, costly to industries or politically controversial, overall, the level of support that there has been for taking strong action to protect our air quality has been tremendous, and it shows.
Yeah, I think California has some very important assets that make it a good example for the rest of America and the rest of the world. And that is, one, as you said, we had the problem of smog. Terrible in Los Angeles, has been cleaned up substantially. Secondly, we had political leaders in both parties, including my father, Pat Brown, including Ronald Reagan, and including other governors that came along, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Gray Davis, Pete Wilson even, who I think even the other Republican governor supported curbing emissions, curbing pollution in California. And thirdly, because of the political support over decades, California has uniquely powerful institutions to actually require conformity, powers of government to enforce rules. So it's not just aspirational. California has the legal instruments to require oil companies, electric companies, gas companies, automobile companies to observe a very strict standards. So, and you've been right at the center of that. So when you have the problem, when you have the political leaders who want to do something about it, and then you have the institutions, that puts you in a position that no other state has had. I might just say for people watching this, California has these institutions, both because of Ronald Reagan and the other governors that followed him, but also because of Richard Nixon carving out a special exemption for California that allowed California, through a waiver process, to set its own tighter standards for auto emissions. And you've done that California's done that, and that's why we're now in a position of being an example for other states. So given that unique position where you've been, where we are at this institute in the state of California, what do you think, could you sketch a few of the priorities looking forward to dealing with climate change, what we might address here at the Institute, also just what the world has to address as well, because the two are not distinct.
Sure. Well, you know, California did set itself a very daunting goal back in 2006 with the Fran Pavley's legislation that said we were going to take on the same level of responsibility for cutting our greenhouse gas emissions as the rest of the world had agreed to in the Kyoto Treaty. So the United States government couldn't ratify the Kyoto Treaty, but California went ahead and by legislation said we were going to cut our emissions back to 1990 levels by 2020. And we set out to achieve that goal. And we did. Actually, we achieved it 4 years early, thereby demonstrating that we had both the political and legal ability and the technical chops to be able to do that. Now, it turns out that that goal wasn't nearly tough enough. And so we now are pushing ahead towards first a further cut of about half, and then getting to zero net carbon or carbon neutrality by 2050, which is the same, again, the international goal that science tells us is what we need to achieve. How we're going to do that, not easy, and especially not easy for a single state. But the tools that we have used and that I think are going to be the backbone of this effort are, first of all, getting to a 100% zero carbon electricity grid where all of our power is going to come from one or another non-carbon sources, such as solar and wind, geothermal and others. And then our transportation system, which makes up about half of all of our contribution to global warming, also then has to go completely to zero. And we do that in part with electricity, and large part of electricity from the grid, which will then be zero carbon, as well as other non-carbon sources like fuel cells, and changing the way people get around so that they have to drive less, and we don't need petroleum anymore. Then we look at our industrial sector and say, how are we going to bring that down? And we just systematically, the way we did with smog, we look sector by sector and we figure out how technically it's feasible to get to zero. Looking at what other countries are doing, we've partnered with other parts of the world on this, especially Europe, of course. And now increasingly looking at ways we can partner with China.
Mary, going back a few years to your earliest days on the California Air Resources Board, which is the regulatory authority of emissions, pollutants going into the air. Could you say a little bit about how the industry in the 70s, when you were the chairperson, how they saw the standards that you were imposing, and now looking back on how tough those standards were or not? I mean, it's because what I'm trying to get at here is the world of 1978 looks very different than the way it looks today. But I think how people saw things and then what they were able to do and have been able to do ever since is worth noting, given the daunting task ahead.
Sure. We did set ambitious goals. And in the case of smog, they were based on health data, what the science was saying about what levels of pollution would have an adverse impact on people, especially children and the elderly. And so we were aiming towards how we would get to those goals. And when we turned to the polluters, the companies, the businesses that were emitting, by and large, they said, no, we can't do that. You're asking things that are going to be too expensive, too difficult. My first foray into all of this before I was appointed to the Air Resources Board in your first term was as a public interest lawyer suing the Reagan administration because they hadn't come up with a plan for how they were going to achieve the health standards. And when we sued them, their answer in court was, well, we can't do that because if you did what you're saying we should do, we would have to change lifestyles. We would have to ration gasoline. We couldn't possibly get technologies that would, clean up the air. And when you came into office and I assumed a position on the board with Tom Quinn as our chairman at that point, we had a staff of people, some of whom had come out of the auto industry themselves, and some of them were in our universities and had expertise in combustion and fuels and so forth. And they just said, look, they're not telling you the truth. They can do it, but you're going to have to make them do it. And so we set out to craft regulations that we were pretty confident were not going to cause the whole flow of vehicles into California to be cut off, despite threats that there'd be models that wouldn't be available for sale and Californians would have to go to Oregon or Nevada to get the kind of cars that they wanted. None of that actually materialized. Because we knew what we were doing, basically, and because industry still wanted to be part of the California market.
Well, I think it's very instructive because, as I remember, you imposed standards they thought were very high, but those standards are ridiculously weaker than the standards that exist today, standards which all the automobile companies are following. So even today we hear we can't do it. General Motors and Toyota sued you as the chairperson of the board because they didn't want to do, said they couldn't do or didn't want to do. And now they've come around and say, oh yeah, we want to work with you. We can do that. So I think the technology has always run ahead of the political awareness or the political sense of business. And so government with knowledge, but with force but forcefully must push ahead. And that's where we are today. And that's where most of the states of the United States are. People are going to say, oh, how can we do this with zero carbon in the grid? How do we do zero transportation? How do we zero industrial production? Well, we don't do it overnight, but we get at it. So in that sense, let me go probe some of the areas that you were very engaged in and that know quite a bit, and I think would be illuminating for other places that have yet to achieve what California has achieved. And by the way, when I say California has achieved, I want to say two things. Number one, California may well be the most advanced regulator of carbon emissions in the Western Hemisphere. But having said all that, we are not even close to where we need to go to get to our carbon neutrality goals. So that's the story. California is in the lead. The other states and countries have to go much further. But even when they catch California, they're just beginning, as California is now relative to the tall mountain we must climb. So let me ask you about carbon pricing. That's something that California pursued. In fact, I think you were the architect of the California carbon pricing program. Could you share a little bit what that was all about and how you see it today?
So California adopted a cap and trade program because that was something that we could do by regulation. The legislature could have adopted a carbon tax, and there were people who thought that a tax would be a better way to put a price on carbon. And of course, we also have a system of direct regulation where we specifically mandate levels of pollution reduction without attaching it to the price. But all the economists that we talked to after AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed, were convinced that you had to have a carbon price to go along with the regulations, either a tax or cap and trade, because otherwise there wouldn't be a way of giving industry enough of an incentive to bring forward the new technologies that were going to be needed to do things in a much more efficient way, to replace petroleum with cleaner fuels and so forth. So again, we would have happily implemented a carbon tax, but that was not something that was going to be forthcoming from the legislature. And so we did it by a cap and trade, which amounts to the same thing, where the board itself was able to tell 700 firms, roughly the largest emitters in California, and then extend it to all of our fuels, natural gas and gasoline fuels, a mandate that they would reduce their emissions by a certain amount of tons, and they would have to have enough allowances, as we call them, to cover their emissions. The way we did the program, we weren't using it as a way to raise revenue for the state. The goal was to set a cap that they would have to live under, reduce that cap over time so it would get lower and lower, like a game of musical chairs, take away allowances from people and force them to clean up. But you gave business the opportunity to choose how to comply. You didn't say you have to put on a particular piece of equipment or you have to use a particular fuel. We just said you have to have these allowances, and you can either get them by staying under the cap, or you can go out and buy them from other people who will create them by over complying. So it's one of those schemes that's beloved of economists. And obviously, it was not beloved by the people who were subject to it, but they thought it would give them more flexibility than if we just went through doing everything by direct regulation. And somebody was going to make money on this deal. And indeed, there have been people that have made money by allowances. And then there have been a lot of firms that have lived within the limits and found ways to comply internally without having to go out and buy allowances from other companies. Eventually, the Canadians, who had also been looking at this, the province of Quebec created an identical system, and we entered into a partnership with them so that we jointly now have auctions, and the state in turn keeps a small number of allowances, which we auction, and the revenue from that has gone into paying for many different good things at the community level that wouldn't have been able to be funded otherwise if we hadn't had those allowances. So it's a kind of a hybrid system, but it's worked very well.
I have a few questions about cap and trade. You said many companies don't buy allowances because they live within the cap.
Right.
Are companies changing their behavior so they don't have to buy allowances and live within the cap, or what? So I'm trying to get a sense of examples of where the cap on emissions perhaps didn't force anybody to change in the short term, so they bought allowances, but over time, they actually improved their behavior and reduced emissions, so they could buy fewer allowances or buy none. Could you tell me a little bit how that might be working in practice?
Sure. The system has allowed the most efficient companies to prosper, relatively speaking, because they had already made investments, or they were willing to make investments in making their operations more efficient. In the case of the utilities in particular, this added some financial inducement to moving faster than what the regulations required in terms of adding more renewables to their system, because they were going to have to pay more for allowances to continue to operate. So it has hastened the retirement of older, less efficient plants, and helped to bring on the next generation of very clean, renewable energy faster than would have happened otherwise.
Well, now tell me, the cap today results in a carbon price of around $18 or so?
Yeah, it's about that.
Okay, $17, $18. All right, now that will that rise as the cap? When you say a cap, that means how much carbon, CO2, and other greenhouse gases can be emitted. And the amount that can be emitted by companies is going down. It's lessening by state regulation. So these industries will have to buy more allowances, or they'll have to get more renewables. That's just the way it works.
Yes, but as you said at the beginning, it's not enough, because we didn't design this program in order to use it as a way to achieve the maximum reductions in emissions. We could have done that, but we feared that there would be a massive backlash on the part of industry, and also that the price of energy might go up so high that it would really affect people. And while there were, economists would say, well, that's great, that proves that they should be using less energy, that's not a message you really want to take out, especially to small businesses, to, residential customers, et cetera. We didn't do that. We designed a system that was going to reduce a small amount, a relatively small amount, big compared to zero, but a certain amount of carbon would come out of the atmosphere at a price that we believed was affordable. So we set a limit on how high the price of allowances was going to go, of $20 a ton, which many people now agree is not high enough to really change a lot of behavior. It's real money, but it's not enough to force big changes in the way industries operate. So when we look to the next round, the next plan, which will be due out in 2022, that's designed to take us, to 2030 and beyond, we're going to have to either come up with new, stronger direct regulations, or reduce the amount of allowances and raise the price in the cap and trade program.
Well, so that there is where the rubber meets the road, because in order to meet the Paris goal, meet our carbon neutrality goal, we're going to have to squeeze carbon out of the system, and you squeeze it out of the system by ordering companies that, with the threat of major government sanction, or you make them pay, which is kind of indirectly doing the same thing. But as you make them pay, as you said, that can create political backlash. And what you faced in California, and to, I think, a wise degree avoided, will have to now be faced by the Newsom administration, by America, by China, by the rest of the world, or not. I mean, isn't that kind of where the world is now, that we're going to have to get tougher than you had to be when you were putting in cap and trade?
Sure. And, one of the points I would make here is that, California set out to do some things to demonstrate what was possible. And I think we were extremely successful in doing that. We launched the cap and trade program right after we were just beginning to come out of the big recession that hit the banking industry, the deep depression where the banks were all in trouble because they had extended way more credit than they had to, and the financial system than they could afford to, and the financial system was in trouble. That we inherited a time when people were very distrustful of markets in general, and here we were launching a new market in a commodity that nobody had ever heard of, and there were all kinds of fears that there would be manipulation of the market, that there would not be, that companies wouldn't comply, and we'd be having massive resistance. And none of that happened. I say we advisedly, because there were, many, many people involved, both within the government and in the private sector, who cooperated to make the system work with integrity and transparency and all the rest of it. So we were able to show that this could be done, and that was really what we set out to do. If you're actually going to meet the goals of carbon neutrality, California's one state. We're a big state within the United States. We're an important state, but we're less than 1% of the emissions of the world as a whole. We have got to have other countries, other states and other countries joining in this effort. That's the only way to bring the price down to potentially manageable levels. And to do it in a way that doesn't hurt the economy of the US. I think we've shown that you can do many things that people thought would be harmful that turned out to be helpful, that created new markets, created new technologies. We made a home for zero emission vehicles. California, although China has, leapfrogged ahead of us, but in the beginning, it was just us doing this. But to make it really solve the crisis, we need everybody involved.
So, and we need everybody, and the everybody is going to have to find the political will to put a higher price than currently exists in California. Isn't that also part of the
yes,
the equation here?
Of course.
Or not?
But I think the way that you describe it, and I don't think this is just PR, I think it's the reality that if you design the programs well, people don't have to see an increase in the cost of living that they're actually dealing with. You can impose the cost on those who can best afford to make the investments and change. And that's what happened with the electricity sector, is that they found ways to comply when they were faced with the threat of having to spend a lot more money to buy allowances. And of course, they had a regulatory regime with a Public Utilities Commission and an Energy Commission, as well as us, that worked together to make sure that we didn't lose supply of electricity, and we were able to maintain affordable prices. You've got to keep your eye on all of those things at the same time.
Yeah, but there's no getting around it. As you want to transition off fossil fuel, gas, oil, and coal, that becomes an item of expense, particularly if you put a burden called a price on the fossil fuel. But if you don't put a price on it, then you'll never get the transition to the zero emission alternatives, right? So
and it's going to make a lot of money on those alternatives too. I mean, that's the thing. It's not a zero-sum game here. It's you're actually expanding markets and making the economy as a whole more prosperous if you do it right.
So on the one hand, the government has to put up money to subsidize solar and wind and zero emission cars, however they do, batteries, development, whatever. On the other hand, you need to put a price on the consumption or utilization of carbon emissions, right? They both go together.
Yes.
And they both will require a political will that I think will be difficult to mobilize in America, maybe in China, Europe. Europe's showing evidence of this. But I just want to be clear that we have a difficult, impactful political decision, which the leaders of the world must embrace and rather soon.
Yes, these are big issues and big decisions that have to be made. But I guess where I would push back against your point is that there's a tendency to make it all sound like it's only going to be pain and not gain. And the gain isn't just that we make our atmosphere, healthier than it would be otherwise. There's actual economic gains if you do it right. One example being that although the US, China, India, together are the biggest players, every country in the world now has taken on and has agreed to take on some obligation as part of their economic development to do something about greenhouse gas emissions. And if you're talking about countries in the developing world where they don't yet have access to all of the goods and all of the mobility that we have, but where the growth is projected to occur, if we can be part of coming up with solutions that help those places develop in a way that doesn't place the same kind of burden on the atmosphere that we did as we were growing through the Industrial Revolution and beyond, we can not only help avoid the worst disasters, but we can also help create markets for the stuff that we're developing, the stuff that we're building and doing. And so you really, it's not pie in the sky, although it's not instantaneous and it doesn't happen automatically, but it can be, these transitions can be managed in a way that doesn't have to be as painful as people fear it's going to be. I mean, the constant drumbeat from the oil and gas industries about how, people are going to lose jobs and they won't be able to get around, and, they'll be forced to buy, golf carts to get around in. So it's just not true. But to get those markets up and running, it does take sometimes both a combination. It does take a combination both of regulation and financial incentives to make that actually happen.
Right. I didn't mean that it couldn't be done. I just think it's going to be difficult. Obviously, investors think that Tesla is a more valuable company than the gas guzzling companies based on the way the market has given Tesla a price so much higher than General Motors or Ford. So this is real stuff. And there are jobs, there are plenty of jobs. To put charging stations all over America is going to have a lot of people employed. There's a lot of stuff to go on. And as you build, you have to put this together with a great infrastructure program where you're making the transition. So they always say jobs are going to be lost. Well, jobs are going to be gained. And if we do nothing, of course, things are really going to get bad. California, forest fires, New York, flooding of one kind or another, Florida, New Orleans, Texas. There are lots of Shanghai, lots of things that would be bad that avoiding is definitely a very solid good. I can just give you a concrete example, small, but just here out in the country where I am, everyone likes to drive these big pickups, and a lot of them are diesels. And when someone stops in front of my house to talk to me, the diesel truck is so loud that I have to yell. And I said to one the other day, well, when you'll soon be driving an electric truck, and I'll be able to hear you without you having to turn your motor off. So things will be better, cleaner, more efficient, and all the rest. One more thing before we finish. Well, how about, can you say something about the zero emission cars and the transition there? What is America, the world face there? Probably similar to what we faced in cap and trade. You're introducing programs and they come on at a certain pace and the transition happens.
Well, this is an area where I would say the California Air Resources Board was ahead of its time, but then the world caught up with us because the board adopted a mandate on companies that sell vehicles in California. Back in the 80s, a small percentage of vehicles were going to have to be zero emission vehicles. And they did that based on information coming from car companies like Toyota, that they had research underway and vehicles under development that would be zero emission vehicles, mainly battery electric, although there was also work being done on fuel cells and very advanced hybrids at that point. But when the time came for compliance, they had not brought those vehicles out and the market wasn't there and the companies were resisting and the board actually had to back off. And my predecessor was the subject, along with General Motors and others, of a movie called Who Killed the Electric Car, which was a very successful documentary that showed, crushing General Motors, crushing wonderful little electric vehicles that they had created. It didn't make it at that time. A few years later, they tried again, they started again. And then not just because of demand, but because of the clear vision of the future that there were just going to be too many people and too many cars and too much pollution, there began to be a little bit more attention to the EVs. And CARB came back and reintroduced and strengthened the mandate. And we also did some things to try to push incentives, which we hadn't had in the early days. So rebates for people who purchased them, a free pass into the bus lane, the carpool lane, if you had an electric vehicle. That turned out to be the most popular incentive of all. And then eventually we even spun off a nonprofit whose sole purpose is to market electric transportation broadly, not for any one company. Car companies started producing new vehicles to the point where now we have over 40 different types of electric passenger vehicles that are available for purchase in California. And suddenly, everything has changed to the point where General Motors is now announcing that by a deadline not that far off in the foreseeable future, they will only be making electric vehicles, and they're running ads in the Super Bowl, touting electric transportation. That has taken a lot longer than I wish it had taken. But in the great span of history, it's like the blink of an eye that this transformation has occurred.
Yeah, and certainly California imposed a requirement, just like China is imposing a requirement. So we have this interaction between government coercion, government saying, thou shalt do such and such, and it actually works. If the regulation is buttressed, supported by good science, good technological analysis, then government can proceed with confidence in imposing rules, and then business responds. And you have to put a lot of money in that direction. You said subsidies, and that is certainly true in China and here. And I think a good example is the vaccine. How did we get such a quick vaccine? Well, the science, the technology, the inventors, but governments bought billions of dollars worth of vaccines that did not exist. So they bought them. And I'm sure that if states and countries said, we're going to buy 5 million electric cars or hydrogen cars by a date certain, they would get them. And so that's an example, both a rule, money, and then we can add incentives as well. So all this is doable. It's always a question of what the time frame is. But generally, if we look back at your career, Mary, we've always been slower than the technology, faster than the industry wanted, but in hindsight, slower than what the technical competence of business actually was. So that ought to give us a lot of confidence that we can be very bold going forward. When I say we, I mean California, America, China, Russia, India, the whole place. So that's really what we're doing here at the California China Climate Institute, pioneering these ideas, discussing, researching, collaborating, and getting us to take the steps needed to make the transition from fossil fuel to a totally zero emission based economy. big job. Maybe it's like climbing Mount Everest, but we'll do it. And you've shown the way. And Mary, thank you for this discussion, but thank you for all you've done all these years to make California in the forefront. I think it's going to be a path that the rest of the world can follow. Thank you.
Thank you.